Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I'm an associate professor of economics at Denison University in Ohio. I'm currently on leave and residing in Nairobi, Kenya, working with PowerShift Africa, which is a climate and development NGO based in Nairobi, but doing work across the continent, and with the independent expert group on just transition and development. I am currently speaking to you from Addis, recording this video. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you. This week is the African Union Summit, and we're doing some work here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you, unfortunately, virtually. I wanted to congratulate you on celebrating International Education Week with all the wonderful themes and speakers that I've seen in the program. And without any further ado, I'll just go ahead and move forward with the main message that I wanted to deliver in this presentation, and with some of the important themes that I'm sure many of you are already engaged in. And I wanted to speak to you about the just transition framework for Africa. And as you can see, the sub-theme that I'm delivering here is the following message: that we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And I'll help unpack this message over the next few minutes. So starting with this report, the Just Transition Report, a climate, energy, and development vision for Africa, which is available online, both in English and French, justtransitionafrica.org. This is a report published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which is a group that was convened by Dr. Yuba Sekona from Mali, who is the outgoing vice chair of the IPCC. And has done incredible work in this space over the last few decades. So what we tried to do in this report is really break the silos regarding the policy conversations about climate, energy, and development. We wanted to put forward a coherent, comprehensive, long-term strategic vision that provides a comprehensive framework for addressing simultaneously all of these major issues. And it's written from an African perspective, but you can really think of it also from a global South perspective, because of the structural issues that we deal with on the African continent are more or less similar to what other countries in the global South in general deal with. So first, the importance of long-term strategic visions. And I always say, if you don't have a long-term strategic transformative vision for yourself, I guarantee you're already part of somebody else's strategic vision. And this is really one of the starting points of this report, of this approach to just transition. And unfortunately, if you think of the historic role that was imposed on the African continent in particular, the global South in general, which is a colonial historical role, that role continues to this day, and we argue that it cannot continue if we're aiming for a just transition or transformation in the global South. So what is this role that was imposed on us, especially in the African continent? Number one, we're the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. Number two, we're the dumping ground for global North industrial output in our large consumer market. Number three, we're the low-cost tourist destinations, exotic tourist destinations, which is not really a platform for development. And number four, and most importantly, we're the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global North, is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, and job creation. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. And that is a key historic role that we played during colonial times, and especially post-colonial times, and it cannot be the role we continue to play moving forward. Next is a couple of key messages that I want all of us to think about very carefully. Number one is we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And what I mean by that is that our efforts for a just transition, for renewable energy investments and infrastructure, cannot be put within an economic context of economic extractivism, of the historic role that was imposed on us during colonial times. So we have to transform the economic structure in order for us to unlock our potential for a just transition and for decarbonization. And I'll show you some of the details over the next few slides. Similarly, you can't really democratize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet, because you can elect, you can have the most transparent elections, democratic elections. You can have the most ambitious, government in place with full mandate from their people, and popular demands for, better quality of life and everything, with all the good intentions. But if their economy is not really under their full economic sovereignty, in other words, their economy is steered from abroad, it is still under colonial extractivist parameters, then you can't really deliver on the democratic mandate that your people have elected you for. And then finally, for countries that are having these conversations about de-dollarization of the global economic system, you can't really do that, again, if you're still operating within an economic structure that is still technically colonized. So setting the stage a little bit for why these conversations are important. I'm just going to give you just a few numbers here just to know what we're dealing with. This report, Groundswell, is a report published by the World Bank, and it's estimating that by 2050, which is the year after tomorrow, basically, on the climate clock, by 2050, there'll be 216 million people displaced globally because of climate events. About half that number, as you can see, is on the African continent. And every time you have mass movement and mass displacement of people on this scale, which we've never seen before, we know that it puts additional pressure on welcoming communities, economically, socially, politically, more pressure on demand for housing, for food, for jobs, for education. All of this tends to exacerbate existing tensions and conflict, and often leads to actual conflicts. So nobody in the world is actually prepared at this point to welcome people with dignity when we're talking about this magnitude of mass movement of people. And of course, a lot of this will translate into mass movement towards the north, towards countries that will be less affected by climate change and countries that have better economic opportunities. And that means we're talking about climate refugees here. And the numbers are unfolding. This is not just, going to start in 2050. We know that this mass movement of people is beginning, and the World Bank report actually shows some of those numbers. So are we prepared fiscally to deal with the economic impact of this climate disruption? And the short answer is no, but we need to think about a framework for dealing with the climate impact. So starting with what I described as the economic, the colonial economic structures, what are these structural deficiencies that we need to tackle if we're going to talk about a just transition? And of course, everybody's familiar with the problem of external debt in the global South, in Africa in particular. Yes, it's an extremely important problem. We're dealing with debt crises in so many countries right now on the continent, with Ethiopia, for example, recently defaulted on part of its external debt. And there are so many other countries that are very close to that level of debt distress. But external debt is a symptom, actually, of deeper structural issues that I can summarize in three major categories. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, manufacturing deficits, what I call low value added industrialization. So let me explain what I mean by that. When I say energy deficits, by the way, I include our biggest oil exporters on this continent who are actually energy poor. Think of Nigeria, the biggest exporter. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline, not by accident, by design. Angola, another major exporter. Today, Angola imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. Libya, and the list goes on, right? So this is not by accident, by design. Number two, food deficits. According to UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Africa today imports about 85% of its food. Again, not by accident, by design, because we used to be the breadbasket during colonial times for the global north. And today we're food dependent, food insecure. Why? Because as soon as we became independent, the global north, Europe in particular, started heavily subsidizing their own agriculture and displaced our farmers. I'm talking here about the European Common Agricultural Policy, which was introduced in 1962, a basic pillar of the European Union to this day, that prioritized subsidizing wheat, corn, barley, soybean, the core crops, essentially. And it wasn't just Europe, by the way, doing this. It was the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, and the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and the Ukraine are very strong in that space. But once wheat and corn and rice from these major producers was heavily subsidized, the African farmers could not compete with the cheaper imported wheat, for example, or imported corn. So African farmers had to switch to prioritize producing cash crops for exports. And as a result, our agriculture on this continent became a complement to the global north agricultural priorities. So we didn't have our own agricultural priorities. We became part of their agricultural strategy. And as soon as you start, serving foreign markets, you have to think about what your customers want. So you start using non-native seeds, which are not acclimated to your environment. So they need more water, which you don't always have. They need fertilizers, which you must import. You need pesticides, which you also must import. And you have to build all the logistical infrastructure and refrigeration and shipping so that you actually deliver to international market. All of it is very expensive and often financed through debt, through loans. And you do this for 10, 20 years, you basically start burning the fertility of your soil because of the fertilizers and pesticides and large-scale monoculture type of agriculture that you put in. And now that your yields are declining, you have to double down with more potent seeds, more potent fertilizers and pesticides, and you just start losing your food sovereignty, essentially. And number three, and most importantly here, the manufacturing deficits, where we were forced to specialize in a very particular type of manufacturing, where you have to import the machines, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, and we even have to import the packaging. So what we do is we use low-cost labor, racing to the bottom, to do this assembly line manufacturing. So we produce low value added content for export, and our imports are high value added content. So no matter how much you double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're always locked at the bottom of the global value chain. So these three major deficits, food, energy, and manufacturing, produce a structural trade deficit. And as you know, every time you have a structural trade deficit, the value of your currency weakens relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, everything you try to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine for your people, you import it at a much higher real cost. So we literally import food and fuel inflation into our economies. And that becomes a very sensitive social and political pressure point, because you could literally have food riots when people can't afford the cost of living and so on. So that puts our governments immediately in a defensive position, using band-aid solutions to do two things. Number one, we subsidize food and fuel to protect the most vulnerable, which you have to do in the short term at least. And number two, we ask our central bankers to try their best to stabilize the exchange rate so that our currency stops falling relative to the dollar. So how do they do it? They start borrowing dollars in order to stabilize the exchange rate, and that starts feeding into the debt crisis. So when we talk about addressing the root causes of the debt crisis, we're talking about investments in the energy sector, in the food sector, in a different kind of industrialization in order to escape this structural trap that was imposed through colonial and post-colonial economic architecture. So let me show you some of the numbers just so we can illustrate. Here's Africa's total exports, $585 billion. You can eyeball the composition of Africa's exports: raw materials, crude oil, cash crops for exports, and low value added assembly line manufacturing, basically, versus Africa's imports, Notice it's core crops like wheat and rice and corn and so on, and refined petrochemicals. So we export the crude oil and we import the gasoline and kerosene and all that, and high value added manufacturing, pharmaceutical products, and so on. And notice the volume of Africa's imports, 737, which means we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. I'm going to zoom in just on one country since I'm in Ethiopia today. I'll show you Ethiopian numbers, but I can show you almost every other country is very similar situation here. Ethiopia's exports, $7.7 billion. And notice the composition of Ethiopia's exports. Coffee, cut flowers for Valentine's. So Ethiopia is one of the biggest exporters, with Kenya, Ecuador, and Colombia globally for flower exports. Notice Ethiopia exports flowers, but Ethiopia has 20 million people today who are dependent on food aid from abroad. So this is the most unbelievable misallocation of resources and inefficiency, and it's a structural trap. It's by design. It's not by accident. So this is Ethiopia's exports. Now look at Ethiopia's imports: $17 billion worth of imports, and notice the composition of their imports. It's high value added content and core food products and so on. So this is typical. So this gap that is widening, gap between exports and imports, is not something new. It's been building up. As soon as you open your economy to more international trade, many developing countries fall into this trap. And of course, the result of it is that the value of the Ethiopian currency, the Ethiopian birr, starts to decline relative to the dollar. So when this line is going up, it means the US dollar is becoming more and more expensive relative to the Ethiopian currency. And the flip side of it is the exponential increase in external debt. And this is Ethiopia's external debt up to recent years. And as I mentioned earlier, a few weeks ago, Ethiopia defaulted on part of its external debt. Notice also how much a country like Ethiopia spends on servicing the debt, paying interest on the debt. So as a percentage of Ethiopia's export revenues, roughly speaking, you're talking about 25% of your export revenues going simply to service the debt. And that's financial resources that are being taken away from national priorities such as investment in education, health, infrastructure, and climate adaptation. So classic problem. Now take this on a global scale. Think of the world and divide it into two categories: global north and global south. And now let's net out all global financial transactions. So we're taking into account all financial transactions: exports, imports, foreign direct investment, interest payments, debt relief, even illicit financial flows. Everything is included here. You get that green line. And notice that green line is moving in the negative direction and accelerating over the last few decades. That green line tells us that the last data point, $2 trillion net, are moving from the global south to the global north. Money is moving in the wrong direction. And this is what I call the neocolonial wealth extraction from the global south. Now, if we don't do anything about the global economic architecture that produces this effect, I guarantee you that number in a few years will be 5, 6, 7, $10 trillion maybe, and moving in the wrong direction. So let's put this in the context of climate finance, right? You have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. You have $100 billion that was promised in Copenhagen from 2009. That $100 billion was not delivered, and whatever was delivered of it, 80% of it, I think, was loans, which contribute to debt entrapment. Then you have the Green Climate Fund, which the last time I checked, I need to update this number, it was about $12 billion in it for the entire global south. And that tiny little dot is from COP28 in Dubai, when we created the Loss and Damage Fund, which is supposed to be the fund to help developing countries deal with the climate crisis. It has about $700 million in it, so not even $1 billion in it. So this is the summary of where we are. But here's what's really upsetting. When you look at the top, oil and gas companies, fossil fuel companies, this is their profits, most recent profits. There isn't a single climate fund that can compete with how much wealth extraction these oil companies, who are actually causing the climate crisis, are making. So this is the reality of where we are. And I always ask people to take a selfie with this or take a screenshot of this so we know what we're talking about if we really want to talk about a just transition. So the structural solutions that I'm about to wrap up here, where do we go from here? Now that we understand what the problems are and what the structural issues are. And I always talk about Pan-African/Global South cooperation for strategic investments in these three major categories: food sovereignty and agroecology. And notice I'm not using the term food security, because food security is actually a post-colonial, loaded term that gives you a good impression because, come on, who doesn't like food security? We should be aiming for food security. But food security was introduced in the 50s and 60s, basically to tell the global South, you want to have food security for your people. So how do you secure your people's nutrition? You either produce the food or you import it from other countries, or even worse, you borrow money to import it from other countries, which feeds into the debt trap. And the worst part of food security is food aid. Because food aid, your farmers can't compete with free food. You can't compete with a price of zero. So food security helped, actually, the loaded concept of food security helped destroy agriculture in the global South. And just to give you an example, I mean, look at the French Ministry of Agriculture. It's called the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty. It's not called the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. So we often see this from European countries in particular. They talk about food sovereignty for Europe and food security for Africa. So investments in food sovereignty and agroecology is going to be the transformation that we need in the global South. Number two, renewable energy sovereignty, not renewable energy for export, which is the majority of investment in renewables that is coming to the continent is actually destined to produce electricity for Europe's energy security, not to manufacture and deploy electricity to the 600 million people on this continent today who have no access to electricity. So that is a major priority. And then number three, and most importantly, it's about escaping the bottom of the global value chain. And that is strategic investments in high value added industrial policies, not just in assembly line manufacturing of high-tech products, but with the particular focus on three core industries, three core priorities for the continent and for the global South. Number one, manufacturing and deploying renewable energy infrastructure for our economies rather than for exports. Number two, clean cooking infrastructure. Today, there's close to 1 billion people on the African continent who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children, because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure. And number three, green transportation. And here I'm not talking about every African having their own Tesla. I'm talking about public transportation, high-speed rail as key priorities, as building blocks of development and prosperity on the continent. And then finally, of course, when we talk about the global economic architecture, that has four components. One is the financial architecture. Two is the trade and investment architecture. That's the role of the WTO. And three, the international tax architecture. So unfortunately, today, most of the conversation is focused on the financial architecture, the World Bank and the IMF, which both institutions are, you can't really reform them or transform them without the approval of the United States. So there's very little progress that can be made in that space. International tax architecture, we finally had a major victory a few months ago when Africa, with the help of the rest of the global South, led to a key vote within the UN to create the UN Tax Convention, which is an important victory because it finally creates a process by which we take the international tax architecture away from the OECD countries, the rich countries, and put it within the UN system, where you have one country, one vote, essentially. And that process is unfolding. So we're making progress on the tax front. The global financial architecture, unfortunately, everything I've seen is minor reforms in the bigger scheme of things, but the major blind spot is the rules of international trade and investment architecture. That is the WTO. And that needs to change, hopefully, in the next few years. So we're talking about a global economic architecture that was not designed by us, not designed for us. These are rules of trade and investment and finance that were established during colonial times. So they were designed for extractive purposes, how can we expect them to deliver a just transition or to deliver any of the results we want on the major crises that we have? So we're talking about transforming this architecture, not just reforming and tweaking around the edges. And to conclude, the time to act is now. And the poly crisis, these multiple crises that we're dealing with, require urgent, bold, and radical action. And I don't mean radical in the political sense of the term, although you can read it that way. I mean radical in the literal sense of the term. Radical means going to the roots of the problem. And if I'm not going to the roots of the problem, then I'm operating at the surface level. And what do we call something that works at the surface level? We call it superficial, right? So we have to make a choice. Do we want radical transformation that goes to the roots of the problem, or do we want to operate at the surface with superficial solutions? That is the choice that we have to make. And here I'm really inspired by the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement in the US, when I'm paraphrasing his famous line where he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism and false solutions and distractions." And similarly today, on the major crises that we're dealing with, we have no time for these tranquilizing solutions, because the mainstream approach that we've been using is too weak, too slow, too expensive, and it doesn't even work, which makes these approaches dangerous economically, socially, politically, and ecologically. And so we really need to think in terms of transformation. And a realistic plan for this type of structural transformation and decolonization requires a fundamental restructuring of the global economic architecture, not just the financial architecture. And we're talking about restructuring and transformation. And then finally, I truly believe that the global South transformative vision that I tried to outline here and that we talk about in the Just Transition report is possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you very much again for your time and for the kind invitation. And I hope to be able to join you in person at some point in the near future. Have a great day. Thanks.